just say I'm not Abby Hopper. Abby, as you heard, extends her apologies. The trade case, we expect the decision to come out maybe today, and so she really felt she needed to stay in DC. So I want to first start by thanking Tyler and Amy and all of you for the warm welcome you've given me today. I really appreciate that. I also want to say, I go to a lot of events, and this is a really strong event. I really enjoyed. I was here this morning for the utility roundtable. I thought the talk later in the morning by Jane was really interesting, and I think I've got some things to say that will sort of follow on to that very nicely. So I really congratulate you on the work that you've done. And let's give Tyler and the team a hand for putting on a really good. Still not Abby Hopper. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are as SEIA, and then we'll move into where solar has been. With sort of I got some numbers for you to show, and then some thoughts about where the industry is heading. And then, as Abby said, we'll talk about some of the lessons that we learned from some of our recent national campaigns, particularly around the trade case this past year, which has consumed an awful lot of time and energy. So who's SEIA? SEIA, as you know, the National Solar Trade Association. Our mission is to build a strong industry to power America. About 1,000 member companies from every state, all market segments, including a lot of solar manufacturers, whether they're making solar panels or something else. And I should mention that we have state affiliates in about, I think it's 15 states now, including one right here in Wisconsin with SEIA. And we encourage all of you to become members of SEIA and to become members of your state affiliate. I think SEIA has, is experiencing a resurgence, and so that's something that I encourage you all to look forward to anyway. My job, as Abby said, I run our state policy team. So when you think of SEIA, I'm going to go back a second. When you think of SEIA, you may think of federal policy, and for a long time that was true. SEIA was, for many years, focused exclusively on DC, particularly on the tax code and some of the federal agencies. About 5 years ago, we added a state team. About 3 years ago, I took that team over, and we're working now in about a dozen states, spread across the country, sort of a combination of the big solar markets you'd expect, like California, and some of the emerging markets in places like the Southeast and increasingly the Midwest. And when we work in the states, we've got consultants, we've got lobbyists, we've got lawyers working in regulatory proceedings, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that as we go along. All right. So I've got some numbers for you. I think it's safe to say these numbers are through the end of the third quarter, which was September. So I think it's safe to say we're over 50 gigawatts of solar in the United States today. There will be over 2 million individual installations this year or next. By 2022, so look forward a couple of years. I know this is the where we've been section, but by 2022, solar will be 5% of U.S. generation. We're going to have 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022. Will be 5% of U.S. generation. And take a second to reflect on that, because 5 years ago we were a blip. We were nothing. And in just a few short years, we're going to be 5% of U.S. generation. I think that's really amazing. And just, Jane showed some EIA figures earlier. I think EIA's projections are something like will be maybe 1-2% in 2022. EIA has pretty consistently underestimated what solar is going to do, the growth of solar. So believe me, don't believe that. All right. It's not just that solar's been growing, but solar has been growing and conventional resources have not been growing as fast, right? We've been becoming a bigger share of the resource mix. Solar and wind are still thought of as alternative energy, and you'll see in some of the slides we saw earlier, some of the polling, what do you want to do, alternative energy or conventional resources? It's not going to be long before solar's not talked about as alternative energy anymore. You can see in 2016 we were the largest source of new electric generating capacity in the U.S., about 39% in 2016. That number's going to be a little bit lower in 2017 for some reasons I'll talk about in a few minutes. But solar and wind are the big parts, the majority of new electric generation in the United States. Have been for the last few years. That's going to continue. Everybody knows that prices have been coming down, and it's really that price decline, as well as both federal and state policy that we'll talk about a little bit later, that have driven this growth. So the bar chart is the growth in solar, so the annual deployments. The yellow line is the price. So now we're down to, this is for all market segments, kind of on an average. What's it say, about $1.80 a megawatt installed. Now, one thing that, sorry, I'll give you a lot. One thing to remember, all these slides, our numbers are always in DC. Our installation numbers are always in DC. Sometimes some of these presentations are in AC and DC get confused, but for better or worse, yeah, those are DC. Prices come down. That makes solar a lot more affordable to a lot more people. It makes solar projects more affordable to utilities. We've seen in places like Georgia, which is now, Georgia, you don't think of the big solar capital, right? Georgia's got 1,000 megawatts of solar installed. They've actually more like 1,200. And it's all because solar beat the avoided cost of conventional generation. And you're going to see that more and more often in more and more places. I'm going to try to slow down a little bit because Tyler gave me some time, so I'm trying to get speeded up. On the price breakdown, so you got a little bit of a price breakdown here. You can see the last slide was kind of the weighted average of pricing that's it's overweighted towards the utility scale sector because the utility scale sector is most of the megawatts. And here you see a little bit of a breakdown between the different sectors. For SEIA, we separate the market into three sectors: residential, commercial, or C&I, right, and utility scale. Community solar mostly will fall in what we call the commercial sector, commercial bucket. Some of the larger community solar projects will fall into the utility scale bucket. It's relatively obvious. The gray here is the sort of the other costs, right, the soft costs. There's still work to be done to bring those soft costs down. They remain stubbornly high. A lot of that is the customer acquisition costs on the resi side, which it's hard. And so I think there's DOE has been funding work on reducing soft costs. Some of the work that we at SEIA have been done in terms of financing has been intended to try to help streamline some of the soft costs. We've got, for example, new standardized C&I contracts that you can use that sort of try to take some of the guesswork out of things. But a lot of work to be done there to continue to bring the costs down and make solar affordable for more people. All right, I've got some numbers for you in terms of both quarterly deployments and a little later we can shift to annual deployments. One of the messages here is that there's a couple different messages here. Again, you see the three buckets or three market segments. So in this one, non-resi stands for C&I. It's more or less equivalent. So the resi sector has been sort of cooling down a little bit. It's driven by a couple things. One is the customer acquisition costs that we talked about a moment ago. Second is the slowdown in some of the big markets like California. So California and Massachusetts have both slowed down a little bit, partly because of some rate changes. California moved from their traditional net metering to what they're calling NEM 2.0 in 2017. And so that has cooled the market a little bit there. The C&I market, or the non-residential market in yellow, has actually been pretty strong. It's always been a tough market, but I think that what we're seeing there is, and I want to talk a little bit more about this later, but strong corporate demand is starting to drive that C&I market. And it's the emergence of some newer markets, right? It's not just California, Nevada, and Arizona anymore, and New Jersey. But we're starting to see solar become something close to a 50-state market that's offsetting some of the slowdown in some of the largest markets. And then, of course, the green bars are the utility scale. A couple of things to note there. Fourth quarter is always the strongest. We actually do expect to see a pretty strong fourth quarter of 2017 when those numbers come out. I believe they come out next month. You've probably heard this story before, but 2016 is giant, and 2016 is going to remain sort of the record for a few years because of the anticipated expiration of the original investment tax credit, right? The ITC was supposed to expire at the end of 16. A lot of projects across the country got contracted to be online by the end of 16, so that created sort of somewhat artificial demand for that particular year. And so that's the reason why you see somewhat lower numbers in 17, and you'll actually see somewhat lower numbers in 18. Once the ITC was extended in 2015, some of those 2016 projects slipped into 17. It resulted in 17 being pretty good. And so 18 will actually be down just a bit. but again, it's mostly on the utility scale side, and it's mostly because of that demand pull-in effect from the ITC a couple of years ago. Okay, I mentioned a moment ago that we are, that solar really is starting to become a market across the country, right? It's not just one market. And actually, the way I want to describe this, it really, you'll see, it really is not one market, because there are different drivers in almost every market. The reasons why one state shows up in a darker color here, as opposed to a lighter color, it differs pretty widely among the different states. So we've now got 10 states that are over 1,000 megawatts DC of installed solar. California, of course, still largest, probably will remain the largest for some time. And you've got states that you've heard about, right, for a few years, Arizona, Nevada. Probably most people are familiar with the North Carolina PURPA story. North Carolina had a pretty strong PURPA market for the last several years. They've done over 2,000 megawatts. Now it's over almost 4,000 megawatts of solar in the last 5-6 years, driven largely by a state investment tax credit that expired at the end of 2015 and a strong PURPA contract. That's actually going to change. But the states actually I would draw your attention to are the states in that kind of third darkest blue, right? The sort of light blue color, Florida, for example, that color. Those states are all in the sort of 200 to 1,000 megawatt category, or number of deployments, or amount of deployment. And there really is a difference. There's a different story for each of those states, and it really brings home, for me, as the state policy guy, the importance of state policy to these markets, right? We work in regulated energy markets. We're always going to work in regulated energy markets. And so state policy is going to matter. So why, for example, does Minnesota have a darker blue? Minnesota's darker blue largely because of the 2013 community solar legislation that is now starting to hit. What about Florida? Florida is mostly FP&L, utility-owned and utility-built generation. Virginia is driven largely by corporate demand. You've got Microsoft did an 80 megawatt deal with the state of Virginia, actually. Amazon's got a server there, and you're seeing the big corporations start to demand power from the utility and the utility and the state trying to find ways to satisfy that demand from the large corporates. And then, and there's as I said, there's a different story for every state. Even Little Connecticut is in that 200 to 1,000 megawatt category, and there, Connecticut's got it's pretty evenly spread among the three market sectors, and that's again because there's some state incentives and some state policy that enables it. Vermont has a 75% RPS. That has driven a lot of solar again across the three market segments there. So it doesn't have to be necessarily one thing in a state, and different policies work better for different states. But it does demonstrate that you do have to have good state policy if you want to really make these markets happen, particularly in the beginning to get things off the ground. I thought Michael's presentation and the awards was really a perfect segue into this slide. And I was really impressed with the breadth of the different projects that were built here in Wisconsin last year. And many of them they both fall into this sort of commercial solar, heading. And they also demonstrate the breadth of the commercial solar heading, right? There's not really a commercial or a C&I market. There's a C&I market, there's lots of different sub-markets. And so you've got a combination of the big box stores like Target and IKEA, which are doing giant amounts of solar per year all over the country. You've got the Amazons and the Apples and the Microsofts that want to do server farms and whatnot that they power mostly with off-site solar, right? Because the facilities are too small to serve with on-site solar. Then you've got the school and municipal markets as well. The school and municipal markets have been terrific sort of bases for a lot of companies across the country because you've got these are oftentimes progressive thought leaders, and they want to be examples for our communities. And schools in particular can save a lot of money by going solar. In part because lots of schools run lousy rate schedules, and they can save money just by changing the rate schedules, and solar exacerbates that or helps that. I guess one other point to make here is that you see a couple of different URLs on this slide. SEIA's got, in addition to our advocacy work at the state and the federal level, we've got a great research team that puts out a number of reports. We put our Solar Means Business Report, which talks about the leading corporate buyers of solar. We do a solar schools report as well, and there's a lot of good information in there if you want to take a look at that. Okay, I'm going to turn a little bit to Wisconsin and the Midwest markets, and just talk about where those markets are and where we see them going. So you can see here, these numbers I think accord pretty well with the numbers that Michael showed earlier. You can see the 2017 big year for Wisconsin, particularly on the utility scale side. I think much of that is are those dairyland projects that were mentioned, right? About 20 megawatts AC, so probably 25, 30 megawatts DC. And we see that growth continuing over the next few years. And it does, as Abby mentioned in her little intro, it does appear that you're going to see growth sort of across the board in each of the markets here in Wisconsin in the next several years. And again, our number is pretty similar to what you heard earlier from Michael. If it's about 85 megawatts total today, it's going to be, you're going to see another 80 or 100 megawatts in the next few years. So good outlook for Wisconsin and something to look forward to. I want to also put Wisconsin in the context of the broader Midwest, right? So in this slide, we've got 8 Midwestern states. Wisconsin is the darkest, I think that's a dark blue color, I'm kind of a little bit colorblind, on the top of the bars. So again, this goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier. What do we see going on here? What we see going on here is a couple things. You see that there's not a whole lot going on in terms of cumulative installations across the region through 2015, right? It peaks at about 100 for the 8 states together. And then what happens in 2016? 2016 is Minnesota's community solar projects finally starting to come online. That continues pretty strongly into this year and next year. The yellow is Indiana. Indiana did a number of utility scale projects, actually started a couple of years ago. And so that looks a little bit lumpy. Only doing sort of one-off utility scale projects, that's by definition lumpy. There's not really a program in Indiana. There's some sort of good results or some decent results. In 2018, that dark blue, I guess it's the medium dark blue, on the bottom is Illinois. So as you know, I think maybe Tyler asked earlier who's heard of the FEJA, right? It's the Illinois RPS bill that was passed at the end of 2016. And we're actually working right now. I've been out in the hall on phone calls because we're working on the implementation of that bill right now. And so you see the expectation anyway that Illinois is going to see some pretty strong growth starting this year and then really picking up in 2019. And you also see Michigan. So Michigan starting probably 2019, Michigan in the orange here. Why Michigan? Well, a couple things. Michigan also did an RPS bill together in 2016, although it's not quite as aggressive as Illinois. But we also saw a terrific PURPA result from the Michigan Commission a couple of weeks ago. The Michigan Commission set the avoided cost rate at a level that is going to pencil out for solar projects. And they set a minimum contract length that's also financeable. Right? So what the big fights around PURPA have been really around that. What's the minimum? What's the eligible project size? What's the avoided cost? What's the term of the standard offer contract? And can you make all those things work? And at least at the moment, it looks like Michigan's got a program that's going to work. So that's why we see. I mean, you can tie these numbers or these colors, these bars, the size of these relative size of these bars back pretty closely to specific things that are happening in the states, and you can get some lessons from that. Right? I mean, I typically say, if you want to have a good state solar market, you need 3 things. You need, I think I might be getting ahead of myself because this is the next slide, but you need three things. You need good net metering policy, you need an RPS program, and you need good interconnection. RPS, we'll talk about in a second, that's starting to change a little bit. And I think, Wisconsin's got a good net metering program. I think the interconnection probably could stand some improvement. And of course, there's no statewide RPS, although we've seen a lot of, we heard a lot of good things this morning from the utilities. Each of your utilities are starting to say, we're going to do some solar. And honestly, I don't know if all those numbers are reflected in here. I think the guys who do the modeling for this report, they don't include every to see that there's some progress made in some of these, towards some of these promises before they start to include that in forecasts. Okay, so I'm going to avoid telling you too much about Wisconsin because you know more about it than I do, but a couple of things. SEIA formed a Midwest committee in 2017. What does that mean? Well, as I say, I run our state policy team in the states we work in. We form state or regional committees, right? And that means that interested SEIA member companies that want to get involved in the policy work in those states, we get together, we talk to them on the phone, we figure out what we're going to do in those states and those regions, we form our positions with the member companies, and off we go. Well, we didn't have any focus on the Midwest until about 2015, 2016. And in 2017, there was enough interest, or by 2017, there was enough interest among our member companies to have us form a regional committee here. It's focused at the moment largely on the implementation of the Illinois program, a little bit of the purple work particularly in Michigan, and some net metering work in Michigan and Illinois as well. A little bit of interconnection planning work in Minnesota, where we're doing some work with MNSEIA. So I think the reason I mention this is that the larger national companies, which are the ones that I typically tend to talk to, because they're the ones that are on my committees, they see the Midwest as a place where they can grow. They see these markets as places to spend some money, to spend some attention, make some investment, because they see some promise here, and it's largely because of things like the RPS bill in Illinois and Michigan, the lack of an extension of the RPS freeze in Ohio, and some of the other good work that's already been done in these states. What else? Oh, if you want to, so there's an email address up there if you want to get involved in our Midwest committee. And then in Wisconsin, as you saw a couple minutes ago, we think the signs are good. We've got some national installers like Sunrun entering the market here. That often tends to sort of rise all boats as that sort of awareness grows among customers. You've got things like community solar and corporate demand. We saw the Dairyland projects, Organic Valley just signed a big project, right? And so you're starting to see it's not just anymore the large multinationals that have sustainability goals, right? That, you've got the RE100, which is mostly really big companies that want to go 100% renewable. So you've got, I think, over half of the Fortune 500 now has renewable and sustainability goals. But that's, as I say, it's no longer the case that it's the largest companies that have those kinds of goals. It's increasingly the sort of mid-sized companies like the Organic Valleys that have those goals and that are starting to make demands on their utilities to find ways to get renewable power to them. And companies are creative. They will either work with their utility or they will find some ways to work around their utility. I mentioned some of the policy leadership in the other states, and then we think that as prices continue to come down, projects like the Big Next Era project upstate will not be the only utility scale project. And the big utility scale project here in Wisconsin. Okay, I'm going to change gears a little bit here. So jobs, and this is going to sort of lead us into the trade case discussion. In 2016, about 260,000 solar workers across the country. That's a 25% increase from 2015. We've been one of the fastest growing industries throughout the country over the last several years. And these are good paying jobs. The average installer job pays $20-25 an hour. It's comparable frankly, to what coal miners make, and there's no black line above. So we've got a good story to tell there. All right, where are we going? So here's the deployment forecast out to 2022. You can see the little dip here in 17 and 18 I mentioned earlier results largely from that big utility scale demand pull-in that resulted in all those 2016 projects and that sort of gigantic increase between 15 and 16. But the market's going to sort of level out, or not level out, but sort of rebound, I guess, by 2019 is the expectation. And then we're looking at doing about 15 gigawatts a year. 15 gigawatts of solar a year by 2019 and sort of, through beyond. And you can see it was only a few short years ago where cumulative installations were less than 1 gigawatt. So this is going to continue to be a success story. My wife sometimes says to me, what if is solar really going to last? Well, solar's going to last. I think we'll be around for a while. So I mentioned earlier that our team works in both sort of the big solar markets and some of the emerging solar markets, or emerging solar states. And so a big part of our work is both maintaining and expanding state solar markets. And so what are some of the things that involves? Well, today, because of the reduction in price, really, more than anything else, there's about 36 states that are at what you would call grid parity for rooftop solar. That basically means that customers can start saving money in year one. Right? So the cost of going solar is, I think the way GTM describes it, is about, I think they could save 10% in year one. And those are your solar markets. Those are your solar markets, is when the state's at grid parity. But that is that's not necessarily going to continue, right? And the reason we talked about is, why is that second bullet up there? If the rate compensation is cut in half, only a handful will remain at grid parity. The reason that bullet is up there is because you guys have been on the front lines of this here in Wisconsin. Not every utility is excited about rooftop solar, right? Not every utility is in love with the fact that their customers want to put solar on the rooftops. And so we've seen, I can show you a different map. This map shows, who's got net metering. But I can show you a different map. Our good friends at the Desire put out a report called the 50 States of Solar on a quarterly basis, which I would commend to you, that shows where some of the activity around net metering and solar rate design. And you see almost every state in the country, some utility has filed a proposal at a state commission or a bill in the state legislature that would change the way that net metered solar customers are compensated, either by doing away with net metering or by changing the rate design, increasing fixed charges, imposing residential demand charges on a mandatory basis. Arizona has what do we call it? We call it a solar tax, but it's an installed capacity fee for the privilege of putting solar around your roof. You get to pay the utility at some dollar per kilowatt. So there's lots of ways that, and I don't want to disparage our utility friends because, in the long run, if we're going to get to the sort of solar penetration that we want, we're going to need to find ways to work with our utilities. And frankly, I think our utilities, as we heard this morning, are starting to recognize that solar is what customers want solar. And utilities are increasingly trying to figure out how to give their customers what they want. But it remains the case that there's lots of ways for utilities to slow down the pace at which solar grows in their service territories, and we're battling them in many places. So we're involved as a SEIA in rate cases in California, in Massachusetts, in Texas, in Colorado, in New York, in North Carolina, and a handful of other states where these issues have arisen, and we're pushing back on things that would be detrimental to solar economics, whether it's increased fixed charges or changes to net metering or demand charges or what have you. And I'll just say, actually, let me show this one. I'd like to show this slide because there's quite a lot of data out there now, and also I put the slide together myself, so I'm proud of it. There's quite a lot of data out there now. The other ones somebody else put together. Quite a lot of data out there now that shows that, we hear a lot about the cost shift, right? Solar customers shift costs on to non-solar customers. That's the line we've heard from since EEI started in 2013. But the fact of the matter is that if you do the math correctly, and solar penetration, particularly solar penetration is low, there's no cost shift. In fact, oftentimes, customers going solar provides benefits to other customers because the utility buys less power, the utility buys less capacity, the utility has fewer line losses, the utility doesn't have to upgrade distribution substations, and on and on and on. So it is true, right, that we can't net meter 100% of customers. Right? I think we could all agree with that. It's also true that there's no cost shift, there's no significant problem for utilities when penetrations are low. And what this slide shows, the yellow, which is the main slide, that is cumulative residential solar installations through 2017. So there's an estimate to the end of 2017. What you see is that there's only about 10 states where you get, I think the scale came out wrong. I think the scale is supposed to be percentages. I translated this from one thing to another. Now I have to be proud of the slide. But if it came out correctly, what it would show is that you only have about 10 states that exceed 4% solar penetration at this point in time. That's the main slide, right? And the data is, and there's a really nice annual report on this, there's essentially no cost shift until you get to something like 10% penetration. And there's good reason to believe that even at 10%, and depending on the local situation, you could still have a net positive. So 10% is the sort of the line where you should think about, okay, I really should be willing to sort of concede something. And the point is, it's only a handful of states where we're even at 4% today, and then the inset is NREL data sort of showing solar projection levels in 2030, and you can see you're still only about 10 states that are up to about 8%, as high as 8% by 2030. Of the interim procedure. So why am I in rate cases all over the country fighting utilities who want to change solar economics today? That is the existential question. So what we're trying to do, what we're trying to signal to utilities and to others is that, look, let's be reasonable here. Let's keep net metering while it still works and before there's an issue, and to get customers involved and to provide some benefits to everybody. And let's be realistic when in places like Hawaii, where they're at something like 20% solar penetration, and California, which is somewhere between 5 and 10, and recognize that the compensation's probably got to change as penetration and deployment really starts to increase. That's a pitch we'll make it to utilities and to state commissions around the country. Okay, renewable portfolios, you can see these, was it 29 states or so have RPSs now. California's talking about going to 100%. Hawaii went to 100%. Vermont's, I think, at 75%. And, you know, RPSs, Nevada tried to go to 50% last year. The governor vetoed the bill. Excuse me, we think that might come back in the next session. RPSs are going to continue to be a big driver of utility scale demand in particular, but increasingly, it's not just about RPS anymore. And this has been evident for a couple of years, but it's really pretty clear now, right? So PURPA has been more and more important today. North Carolina, as we mentioned earlier, about 3,000 megawatts of solar, almost all sort of, they do have an RPS in North Carolina, but it's really the PURPA the contract that's driven that deployment. South Carolina today, very exciting PURPA market. Michigan, as we mentioned, has got a PURPA market we expect to start taking off in the next year or so. So defending PURPA at the state level and actually the federal level as well can become more and more important. We've got a lot of utilities that are arguing that PURPA has outlived its purpose. And that would have a big impact on our markets. The other thing, and it's not. So corporate procurement. We talked about this a little bit already. I think it's really the corporates that are going to be the big driver, because it's good, whether it's direct or indirect, right? It's whether it's Microsoft doing a one-off deal with the state of Virginia, or Microsoft and its brother get involved to make sure that the RPS doesn't get vetoed by the governor in Nevada next time around. We're going to see those customers adding to the voices of residential customers, demanding that the utilities give them the opportunity to go forward. All right, talk a little bit about the federal side. So, as you know, there was a lot of concern when Congress took up tax reform that the ITC would be hit. We felt reasonably good about the ITC going into it because we had extended it at the end of 2015. And our argument to our sponsors, our friends in the Senate in particular, was, hey, a deal's a deal. We heard pretty early on, particularly from our Republican friends on the Senate Finance Committee, that was their view as well. And in addition, of course, the ITC already has a phase down. And so I think there was recognition by, at least particularly the Senate, and then on the House Ways and Means Committee as well, that that was a deal that was worth preserving and there was no reason to disturb it. So the ITC itself did fine. What came up in the last second, which is still causing some concern, is the BEAT, which is the base erosion something provision. I should know this. Which is a provision that I was reading a memo yesterday from our tax advisors in DC. I could read it to you, and if you could understand it, you would be ahead of me. The BEAT basically is supposed to prevent companies from getting around some of the provisions that encourage them to bring the cash back on shore and basically repatriate out of country tax and out of country profits so that the tax gets paid on, right? And so the BEAT is a way to sort of prevent that from being avoided. It has an incidental and I think unintended impact on the IPC because in some cases, and don't ask me any questions about this, in some cases, the impact that it has is that it makes the ITC unutilizable. It's sort of company has to, that tax credit goes away. They have to repay it. They take the tax credit and then the BEAT kicks in and they end up paying the same amount they would have in tax despite the ITC. Now, it's not the same amount because due to a lot of hard work by our lobbyists in DC and our federal staff in DC, 80% of that BEAT actually gets preserved, or 80% of the tax credit is exempt from the BEAT. So there is, we did get a special provision that we would get hard to get to sort of mitigate the impact of the BEAT, but we're still hearing from a lot of companies that 20% that still is out there is going to reduce the available tax equity for projects and is going to potentially either increase the cost of projects or make some projects unable to get accomplished. So that's the, we're still, there's still a lot going on in Congress, or a lot of talk going on in Congress at least, about fixing various things that people are unhappy with. This is the thing that we're unhappy with that we're continuing to try to get fixed. And there's a couple of different vehicles that are out there that we may be able to hit the light on to get this fixed. All right, so a couple other things to talk about before we turn to the trade case. Codes and standards are, I think, increasingly important. You've probably run up against fire departments here that say, hey, I don't want to get if the house is on fire, I want to make sure that I'm not electrocuted. That's a pretty reasonable approach. However, that's a pretty reasonable concept. However, the approaches to solve that have sometimes been unreasonable. So we're working with both the people on the fire code and on the electrical code to ensure that you have reasonable revisions for the next round of code that both actually increase safety and don't discourage the ability of customers to go solar. So SEIA in the last 2 years has added some staff to work on these, that they spend their days working on codes, going to these code meetings. Another bunch of, to me, unintelligible things, really important. Consumer protection has been a big issue in a number of places. Everybody has heard or seen on TV the horror story of the little old lady who was promised X and got Y, right? The system doesn't produce what it was supposed to. I thought I was buying it and I'm leasing it. I can't sell my house, this kind of thing. These stories in fact, they're few and far between, but they tend to resonate. And so we spent a lot of time in the last couple of years developing a set of consumer protection materials. These are materials both for customers, right? So you see the residential customer's guide to going solar. So what the kinds of questions the customer should ask, the kinds of things the customer should know before they make a decision, and ways to help customers ensure that customers are making informed decisions to go solar. And then we've also put out materials for our companies. So there's the Solar Business Code, which sets out a set of things that we want our member companies are required to do, right? And it's, most of it's pretty common sense. It's be straightforward with the customer. It's a set of things in greater detail that guide the business to not getting into those kinds of situations. And to supplement that, we now developed these disclosure forms, so standardized disclosure forms that we encourage our companies to use with their customers. Customers can then make apples-to-apples comparisons among different offers they've gotten from perhaps more than one installer. And they can also, it provides some assurance that all the relevant information is being provided to the customer. And we've been pretty successful with these materials. I think initially the tack we took was, hey, hey state, you don't have to have consumer protection legislation because look, we've developed these materials and we're an industry that's policing ourselves. And to be honest with you, I think that's probably the way that we'd like to approach it in most places. But states, I think, are increasingly concerned, sometimes because someone's got an axe to grind, and sometimes because they're just trying to make sure that the right things get done. But we've now seen the SEIA disclosure forms incorporated into legislation in Nevada and in Florida, to some extent in Utah and New Mexico. And we're working on getting the SEIA sort of approach incorporated into the Illinois consumer protection aspects of their adjustable lot program. So what we try to do, we've changed our gears a little bit to try to not just inform customers and companies, but also inform regulators and legislators and ensure that if they're going to do consumer protection, they do it in a way that actually protects consumers rather than just throwing up barriers and allows business to get done. Tyler, tell me if I'm running long.
I'll take 1 second to say I'll start collecting questions.
Okay.
A few questions.
Great. Yeah, I have to take questions here in a couple of minutes because I'm coming towards the conclusion. All right. Workforce diversity. This is a big SEIA initiative. Abby is our first female CEO. It's a big initiative of hers to ensure that that diversity in the solar workforce at SEIA and the events that we produce and the companies that are our members is top of mind. And so you're going to hear us talking about diversity sort of over and over again. We really think the solar industry is doing reasonably well, right? Or at least it's creeping up in terms of a diverse workforce, but there's a long way to go to see compared to the overall workforce. I would be remiss if we didn't talk about storage. Storage is the next big thing, right? I mean, what I like to say is that, we see this more in places like Hawaii or California than you may see it today in Wisconsin, but where you have increasing amounts of solar penetration, you see an interest among utilities and grid operators, even more than utilities, in better aligning that solar output with peak demand, and in managing variability, and in other kinds of things that storage can do. So I would say that among the sort of larger companies that make up our board, for example, almost all of them are either fooling around with storage, actively engaged in storage, or thinking about storage. And that's both residential companies and utility scale companies. So we've seen out west utility scale projects being developed with a permit to install storage. They're not necessarily installing storage today because they don't have they're in a contract for it, they're not getting compensated for it yet, but they are preparing those projects to have storage adopted. I think that today storage economics are such that, I think you heard this morning, it's kind of a niche market. You've got storage in places like New York and California where you've got high commercial demand charges and storage can knock out those demand charges. You've got storage in places like California, in a place like Hawaii where you basically can't put a solar system on your house anymore without putting storage on it. But the economics aren't there for that to be widespread. But the storage cost curve looks very much like the solar cost curve did a few years ago. I think you're going to see that coming down very quickly. And in the next, I don't know what the year is. It's 2 years, to 5 years, to 10 years. We're going to see storage taking off at a pace that looks a lot like solar. And so when we're engaged in regulatory proceedings today, we are trying to do things like create solar plus storage friendly rates. We're supporting storage incentive programs. We think that solar and storage are like peanut butter and chocolate. Two great tastes that taste great together. The more solar is, the more opportunity there is for storage to do the kinds of things that it does. And the more storage there is, the more ability there is for solar to continue coming online, particularly in places where you've got high penetration. So, and the graph on the right is an example. Right, this is the famous California duck curve, where you see that in the middle of the day. This is a spring day, right? This tends to get exaggerated a little bit. This is not what the grid looks like every day of the year. But in the spring, when there's a lot of runoff from the snow, and so we got a lot of hydro generation, and it's not hot yet, so there's no air conditioning, and so loads are low. But heck, in late March, you got a lot of solar production in California. So you've got periods of potential over-generation. There's more generation coming online than the ISO can shed, than the grid operator can shed, because you've got things like nuclear plants and long start gas plants that can't be turned off, imports that are contracted for that can't be shut down. So you've got a situation where you've got more generation than you can deal with, and so storage is going to be part of, I emphasize, the answer to this kind of thing. At SEIA, we're doing a lot of work around grid modernization. On the left there is the series of grid mod papers we've been putting out. These papers are primarily focused around distributed generation, so on a distribution system rather than on a transmission system. The fourth one came out just earlier this week, and you can find them all at the link that's there. And what we're trying to, I think you heard somebody this morning talk about the Wisconsin Commission to take a look at grid mod. This is happening everywhere, right? And it's happening because of improvements in technology. And it's not just improvements in solar technology, it's the availability of storage, it's new communications systems, it's this whole smart home sort of movement. There's a variety of reasons why utilities are looking at grid modernization. And what we're trying to do with our white paper series is provide some thought leadership on how to do grid mod right, and how to do grid mod in a way that provides opportunities for solar to solve some problems. Part of that is providing compensation to solar systems. Modern solar systems, modern inverters provide a lot of good services. They're not really compensated for yet. Commissions and grid operators haven't really necessarily figured out how to compensate rooftop solar system for providing VAR, or providing voltage support, or providing frequency support. But those systems can do it, and there's an opportunity cost to doing it. So that's part of the puzzle that we're going to try to solve here over the next few years. Okay, finally, what you've all been waiting for, right? Section 201 petition. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about what the petition is, but I'm happy to answer questions if you're not familiar with it. That basically, as mentioned earlier, the decision is expected this week. It's due by next Friday, the 26th, is the deadline for the President to act. And what the petitioners have asked for are tariffs, and they actually were again yesterday in some press release or something that went out, a tariff of 50% on imported solar cells and modules. That would have a pretty big impact on the cost of doing projects, particularly larger projects, right? You saw from the slide earlier, component costs are a lesser percentage of residential projects, for example. So some of our residential installers have said, yeah, it's going to be a problem, but it's not going to sort of kill our company. But for utility scale projects, it would be a major hit, particularly 50%. And what you see here in this slide are both the jobs impacts and the deployment impacts of the relief that the petitioners have asked for. And so you can see that instead of doing 15 or so gigawatts a year in the next few years, we would be doing 10-ish gigawatts. So we're talking about knocking a third of the market out over the next several years, and a corresponding decrease in employment. So you're talking about knocking about 80,000 jobs, about 80,000 U.S. jobs. If the petitioners were to succeed. The way that this has developed, let's see. Okay, well, let's put the next slide up here. The way this has developed is that the case that went first to the U.S. International Trade Commission. It's a 5-member body that once seat's vacant. There's 4 commissioners. They made 3 recommendations to the president. 4 of them made 3 recommendations to the president with quite a range of proposals. They made the recommendation to the U.S. Trade Rep and the President. The U.S. Trade Rep held a hearing in early December, and what we understand is now on the President's desk is a recommendation from the U.S. Trade Rep based on both the ITC recommendations and additional information that the USTR has gathered himself. But what's key to understand here is that the president, this is a very unusual statute, the president is not constrained by those recommendations. And so the recommendations, actually the worst recommendation from the ITC was a 35% tariff. And the highest tariff the president can impose under the law is 50%. Well, the president's not constrained to the recommendations by the ITC. He could do 0, he could do 50%, he can do anything in between. And we just don't know until it happens what it's going to be. So there has been a lot of noise coming out of DC in the last couple of weeks. We at one time thought we were going to get a decision last week. Today we think we're going to get a decision this week. The decision is due next Friday. So we'll know more soon, and if anybody is watching their phone and the decision comes out, let me know. You can see that it really would be national, and I'll show you a little bit more about why in just a minute, right? Because these jobs, these are not only installation jobs, right? So it's not only the jobs of the biggest solar markets that these impacts will be felt, it's jobs, it's states in which people are making electrical fasteners, people are making racking and tracking and wires and zip ties and electrical labels, they call them in tiny down here, would be felt. And we tried to make this case because it seems like one that the president might respond to. There's about 38,000 jobs in U.S., 38,000 manufacturing jobs in the U.S. today that are solar related. Right? So these are not actually manufacturing modules and cells. They're manufacturing everything else that goes into a solar project. And as prices has come down, right, solar panel prices have come down, those jobs have gone up. Manufacturing jobs have gone up in the U.S. Since as prices have come down. Now, manufacturing of jobs in manufacturing cells and modules hasn't corresponded, right? But overall, manufacturing jobs have gone up. And there's over 500 different companies in just about every state, a number of them here in Wisconsin, where those 38,000 jobs are located. And so you would feel these job losses nationally. Okay. I'm happy to come back to the trade case when you have some questions, but this is I'd say the trade case in particular has been pretty transformational for SEIA this year. There's been this sense of urgency. We've brought in quite a lot of money to fight it, and taken this leadership role against it, and have used that money in ways that we think have some lessons for our federal team thinks that has some lessons for me and my team, and maybe for you as well. And some of these are common sense, and many of them actually are sort of follow the logic that Jane mentioned to you earlier, right? They're along the lines of make friends, right? Messenger matters. So this talks about the DOE because I think these particular letters had to do with the DOE recommendation to the FERC to basically prop up the coal plants. And here we teamed up with basically all the other renewable industries to talk about what the impacts would be on renewables and why this was a bad idea. It's a little hard to read, but on the left you've got the Biogas Association, the Biomass Association, the Hydropower Association, as well as NVIA and ACOR and SEIA. A bigger voice, it gives you a bigger seat at the table. A bigger, broader voice gives you a more effective seat at the table. And we've expanded on that in the trade case. So we are working not only with our sort of natural allies, right, the other renewable associations, but with some somewhat unlikely allies. ALEC has joined us. Some of the utilities, including Duke, are with us on this point. R Street is a conservative or libertarian think tank based in D.C. Heritage Foundation you've probably heard of. And all these companies have gotten engaged, not so much because they love solar, but because they think trade restrictions are a bad idea, right? So this free trade, this has not been just simply a solar issue, it's been a free trade issue. And we've taken advantage of that to gain more allies and to deploy those allies effectively. Because again, we have a very unusual statute here. We don't have a statute where the commission, a federal or an agency is making a decision. We have a statute statute where the president is making a decision. So we have to find ways to get to the president, to communicate, to find people who can communicate, and to whom the president will listen. And then we've really expanded both our traditional and digital media. We spent a fair amount of money on communications. You may have seen the Sean Hannity ads telling the president not to impose tariffs on solar. And we've seen, we've ramped up those efforts around the time of major events in the case. And you can see on the right, there's a sort of corresponding jump and increase in attention as a result of some of the traditional media. So we've really gotten a lot of attention from this, and we've been trying to then to deploy that attention. And of course, the traditional lobbying and education, the kind of stuff that Jim does, the kind of stuff that the lobbyists and consultants that I hire do, our federal team as well. They've spent a lot of time meeting with members of Congress, and frankly, particularly Republican members of Congress that the president may listen to, and then of course with the administration itself, and trying to find who might we talk to that might be willing to carry our case to the decision maker. And we've got some good results. On the left, that letter, the U.S. governor's letter, it's a bipartisan letter, 2 Republican, 2 Democratic governors asking the president not to put trade restrictions in place. And so, the effort is worth it. And you see letters similarly from both the Senate and the House, again, bipartisan letters urging the president to not impose restricted trade remedies. So with that, I'm ready to take some questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sean, for coming. Are you able to stick around?
I'm going to stick around.
The look I'm getting and the whispers when I scanned the room was thirsty.
I'll take questions over beer.
So I have one question that I think we can answer in jest while I get everything else ready to close this thing up. But Elon Musk, helping or hurting the sustained growth of solar?
Gosh, you really know how to hurt a guy, look, I think broadly helping, right? I mean, Elon Musk has built a solar manufacturing facility in Buffalo, New York. I think as we heard earlier, EVs and solar go together very nicely as well. Elon as a personality has attracted a lot of attention, not all of it good. Elon as a businessman has built some terrific businesses that are supporting various industries.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, please join me one more time in thanking Sean Gallagher.